We'll see. Shabbat Shalom. It's nice to see you. I think this is the third time I've done this. And for those of you who haven't done this with me, can everybody hear me if my voice is high enough? Yeah. I prepared a handout. I usually try to do that so that you get an idea of what I want us to think about. And what I like to do when I've done this for you is rather than going over the whole parsha, to try to concentrate on one section for a deep dive. I'm quite interested in the Hebrew and how the various commentators and particularly the various versions of the Tanakh that are being used today compared to earlier ones in terms of translation. And I particularly, since our synagogue uses Eitz Chaim, I'm always interested in how the Eitz Chaim translates the Hebrew compared to some of the other translations. And what I've put in the handout for you is the English for the first 4 verses, plus 4 particular commentaries on the look of the parsha, which I think we'll try to do some things with. So first, I'd like to mention that Ha'azinu is one of the few parshiot which is read completely, even in synagogues that are on the triennial cycle. It is not divided. We read the whole thing. So, when you look at it, you'll see why it's one of the parshiot that really, it can't be divided without messing up what it is about. It's also, one of the questions is the name for the parsha. So we call it by the first word, Ha'azinu. In Hebrew, it's usually referred to as Shirat Ha'azinu. And in English and in Christian commentaries, it's referred to as the Song of Moses. So that already tells you that what we're going to be looking at is a poem. And one of the things I wanted to see first, if you look at in the Eitz Chaim, it's on page 1185. So the first thing I looked up was, well, it's a poem. So if you're not, if you take out a Chumash or a Tanakh, and you're not looking at a Sefer Torah, how do you know it's a poem? Well, it turns out you don't, because in the Tanakh, it's written in 2 columns so that you know as soon as you see it that it is a poem. And I thought that this already tells us that our forefathers and the people who wrote all the Sofrim who scribed the Torah understood that we were looking at a poem and that a poem has rhythm. And therefore, the way we will look at it will make a very big difference if we're looking at it in Hebrew or we're looking at it in English. So I have a question for all of you. Some of you, I think, probably know about this. How is poetry looked at in Hebrew? What is a poem? In English, we have various rhyme patterns, iambic, pentameter, and so on. What's Hebrew poetry?
Is it alphabetical acrostic?
Often it's an alphabetical acrostic. What's the other thing about the...
it's the author's name.
That would be the author's name. You see that in some poems. The other thing is, what do you look for in the lines? So in English poems, it's often a 5-line pattern. What do you usually see particularly in biblical Hebrew poetry?
That was symmetry. Tichbolet, I think.
Yeah, it's called a tichbolet. You see parallelisms. It's usually 2 lines are a pair. And you can, and when you read the rhythm is usually the 2 lines pair with each other. The other thing you often look at is plays on words, particularly at the end of the line, that the rhythm at the end of the line, the one part will attach to the other part of the line. So and you can find a play between this, and you wonder, why is that word used in the second line? and it usually has some relation to the first line. So that's one of the things we're going to look at in particular as we're going to take a look at Ha'azinu. The other thing that we're going to look at is the kind of Hebrew that's here. And here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the various documentary hypotheses about the origins of the Torah and where various sections come from. But we'll find in what we're going to look at, is particularly in the commentaries, there's a lot of feeling that Shirat Ha'azinu is one of the oldest parts of the Torah, and that it's probably older than the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. Why? The language, the Hebrew of it. The Hebrew seems to be older Hebrew. Robert Alter, who's one of my favorite ones to look at because he's very interested in the origins of language, notices a lot of similarities to words in Ugaritic. Everett Fox also notices that. There also seem to be similar poems in other cultures of the time. This poem is definitely a poem that's ours, and whether it was when it's called Shirat Moshe, is not that Moses wrote it. Why is it called Shirat Moshe then?
Because that was the last thing he said.
Because it's the last thing he said, and it's attributed that Moses said this as the last thing he said. So
also people also compare it to Az Yashir.
Yes, but that's also, we're going to look at it and compare it to the last thing said in the book of Genesis, which is on the before the death of Yaakov. So what's interesting when you look at the Bible is that the first book, Genesis, ends with a heroic poem, the chapter before the end, where Yaakov, the patriarch, feels he is going to die. And the whole Torah ends with a poem before death, not a deathbed, but at the location. Nina, you were going to...
Yeah. I was just wondering if this is the only parsha that that's through the mouth of Moses or a person rather than God, because most of the parshas, or maybe all the others, are usually coming directly from God.
No, I mean in terms of instruction in it.
Yeah,
because there's lots of parshas
usually
that are descriptive.
Right.
So,
but I mean in terms of a voice.
Well, you have things that are said by said by Moses, said by Abraham, said by Isaac. There's not a lot of direct speech in the Torah in general. So in this case,
yeah, but that's what's unique about Moses, who started with a speech impairment and ends with such a beautiful poem.
Thank you. That's one of the things I want to what we will discuss is that Moses, who can barely speak, delivers this poem in the name of God, and he doesn't say I'm saying this for God. As he speaks it, it appears to be that he's saying the words of God, and it's one of the few things like that. So let's first start with the very first verse 1. Would someone like to read out the Hebrew for us?
What page is it?
It's 1185. You have a regular reader? Okay, so who wants to take the Hebrew?
1185.
1185, verse 1. Sure.
All right, I'll try it.
Okay.
Azinu Hashemayim ve'adabra ve'adabera v'tishma ha'aretz imrei fi.
That's it. Azinu ha'shamayim ve'adaberna tishma ha'aretz ve'imrei fi. So, and the English for it, if you noticed, If somebody wants to read out the English for it, anybody can do that.
You mean give ear?
Mhm.
Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter.
So what we hear in this,
Well, there's a difference between Azinu and Shema.
right? So let me get to that. Thank you, Esther. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about. I want to first mention there are 4 words for speaking in the first verse. You have ha'azinu, give ear. Ve'it adaberna, and I will speak, from the word speak. Tishma, from the word listen, let me, or hear. And the imrefi, and I will speak or I will talk. So what are we trying, what is trying to happen to us right here? What is Moses saying first? With
Their attention and
pay attention, listen.
Yeah.
4 different words related to speech. Azinu, and we're going to start with that one first. So ha'azinu is from the word ozen. What's your ear? So if you think of it, we have the same thing in Shakespeare. He uses the same, and we think probably from here.
Yeah,
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. It's the same word, azinu. Lend me your ears. So why is that more powerful than saying, listen to me? What's the difference between saying azinu and in the repetition when it says,
There's a distinction between hearing and listening.
yes.
People can repeat exactly word for word what somebody is saying and still interpret those words differently. The goal is to listen. Hearing is just auditory perception.
Exactly. So most of the commentators have commented on this because we talked about that Hebrew poetry is a parallelism. So in the first line, it's ha'azinu. Let me listen with lend me your ear, pay attention. And you notice the English is trying to not use listen. It's saying give ear. Because how do you make that distinctive from the Hebrew in the second line where it says tishma, which is listen, but here, but who is supposed to listen?
Heaven and earth.
It doesn't say us, doesn't say humanity.
Well, it's
Above and below.
Tishma haaretz.
The earth and the heavens.
Let the whole earth hear this. So this is not being spoken. Ha'azinu is not just for Bnei Yisrael who's gathered to hear these words. This is for everybody. And so everybody is haaretz, which would also imply not just humanity.
I actually thought of it the opposite. It's the earth itself, the land that's supposed to hear, not the people.
That's another way to hear.
Because it's talking about heaven and earth, which somewhere else they're witnesses somewhere. In some parts or other, they're witnesses. Heaven and earth are the witnesses.
Right, and this also leads us back, if this is we're coming to the summary of the Torah, this leads us back to Breshit, Hashamayim v'ha'aretz. So that's a tremendous circularity here for the listener as far as that goes. And the other point is, we talked about the parallelism. And so if you hear them now as a poem, it would be Ha'azinu hashamayim va'adaberna tishma ha'aretz imrefi. So it's da-da, 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 that it's the same feeling to it and the same rhythm as far as that goes. Now, I thought we should look at what Alter says about this. And I gave you his comment on just this verse. And if someone who's a good reader, in case there's people online who didn't download the handout, I'd appreciate it. Lois, you want to read it for everybody?
Give ear, O heavens. The high stylistic solemnity of the poem is signaled by a formal beginning, verses 1 and 2, that calls attention to the poet's own act of uttering sublime speech. This convention constitutes an approximate analogy to the invocation of the music and the proclamation of the subject of the poem at the beginning of the Homeric epics.
So I want to stop right there. The Homeric epics, what is he referring to there?
Probably the Iliad and the
The
Odyssey.
Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer.
Yeah.
Now, are those before or after this?
After.
They're after. So the idea is that the Greek he's implying that most the Greek writers of the Iliad and the Odyssey must have known of this because it's the same kind of an opening that's in those as well, showing that this comes from ancient times. Want to continue, please?
The address here to heaven and earth as witnesses is replicated, as many commentators have noted, by the opening line of Isaiah 1. The Song of Moses, traditionally referred to in Hebrew as we have noted as Shirat, the Song of Hazinu, is certainly older than the body of Deuteronomy, though how much older is a matter of scholarly debate. Many, though not all, of the grammatical and morphological features of the language, as well as certain aspects of the syntax, are archaic, and numerous formulaic word pairs in the parallel members of the lines are ones that also occur in the pre-biblical poetry of Ugarit.
That's why he studied Ugaritic poetry. Go ahead.
On stylistic grounds, then, the poem, or at least much of it, could be as early as the period of the Judges, that is, the 11th century BCE. As with any archaic poem, one encounters rare terms of uncertain meaning and a number of points where the text appears to have been scrambled in scribal transmission, whether out of sheer confusion or through the theological censorship of the ancient materials.
So those of you who have studied Robert Alter know that he's very much concerned about language and the age of the material, and whether we've been able to preserve things in the scribal tradition or whether things have been lost. Those of you who read Torah know that periodically you get something where it says Creek, where what we read and what's written are not the same, and that's where there's agreement that something's been lost over time. There are not a lot of those, but Alter thinks there's more of them than the ones that are marked where just because before printing the human error in just transcribing the Sefer Torah would have brought some errors in. Those of you who type know how often you can get that, and with autocorrect today, how often the autocorrect makes the mistakes for you. Nina, and then
Sylvia, what is Ugaritic poetry? I'm not familiar with that.
Well, so Ugaritic is the ancient ones. There's Chaldean, there's Mesopotamian. These were all in the neighboring tribes. If you go to the Cleveland Museum of Art, there's a great big stylus from one of the temples there that has I think it's Chaldean. I don't ask. It's one of the early languages on it. And we once went with a professor from Akron who could decipher it and discussed how similar in the rhythms it was to Hebrew poetry. So this is an example. Alter has noticed that ancient Ugaritic poetry seems to have the similar parallels.
I wonder, is this not a message to the whole planet? And how does that relate to this Kol Hanshama Hallelujah, Hallelujah in the Amida? Let every living thing go a certain way. Does that connect with this? And so
well, I don't know if this one does, but one of the things we're going to see in the first 4 verses is one thing that's has entered the liturgy, and you'll see all through Ha'azinu there are lines. Because don't forget, it's 54 lines that have entered the liturgy, and reflect this feeling of gratefulness to the glory of heaven and earth, to be appreciative of it. So any more comments on the first verse? So let's look at the second one. I think we do enough with Ha'azinu and Shema for everybody here. So everybody's okay on that. And we also did the Daber and the Amar, so an example of the parallels. All right, so let's read out the second one. If anybody wants to take the Hebrew, go ahead.
Hebrew, no.
You don't want to take the Hebrew, okay? Anybody want to take the Hebrew for me?
You made a ring. Where are you? I'm happy to read.
We're on 1185, and we're first.
Do I have the wrong thing?
No, you have the right thing, but I'm asking. I didn't put the Hebrew on there. So, if you'll take verse 2.
Very good. Vayaroch kamatar likli hizal ketal imrati kishirim ale desha uchrivim ale esif.
Right. So and let's read out the English for it, and then we'll look for what's parallel, and again the repetitions.
Do you want me to chant it? Is it better if you hear it chanted?
I think we're okay. Thank you. Who wants to to do the English for us? Go ahead.
Yeah. May my discourse come down as the rain, my speech distill as a dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass.
So let's look and see what the parallels are here. That if they're as obvious as in the first one. So the first verse is getting our attention, and the whole earth should hear about what we're going to say.
Desha and Esef.
Desha and Esef, exactly. Both are synonyms for the grass.
And Tal Umatar.
And Tal Umatar, which are two different words for light rain, which both usually are translated as dew.
But isn't Matar more of a... Tal and Matar to me are not the same, because Tal is dew and Matar is like a pouring rain.
But for these purposes, it's similar. It's water.
Okay, the both water, that I'll accept. So I looked up what Rashi had to say about this verse, and Rashi interprets it as that what is being referred to here is Torah is like the rain, which provides life to the world, and he interprets that when it says may the speech rain down as the dew or as the rain, to mean that it should come in small droplets, because we can only learn things slowly and small amounts. And so that this poem, that Moses should teach the children of Israel slowly, the knowledge raining down on the people in small proportions, so that we'd not be overwhelmed and wiped out, which I think is an interesting interpretation.
I think it's a beautiful interpretation.
Yes, isn't that a very nice interpretation of the issue of the rain? And
I was gonna say also the rain, and when it soaks in, so it's soaking in, you're hearing these things, and you're processing it like the water soaks into the land.
Yes.
So you're absorbing it. You're absorbing all this knowledge.
Yes, but one of the things we'll notice when we get to Arnie Eisen is one of the things he talks about is when it's dew, it comes in very slowly and is soaked extremely slowly. But even matar is if you absorb it drop by drop, because when you think about yourself how many times do we study Torah? Because you can do it over and over and over again until you ever absorb all of it. And so if you take the opening line of what we're looking at here, and you add to it the second line, which so the first one, listen the heaven and earth and to what I'm going to say, and then let you understand what I'm going to say. And it's interesting that it's called discourse or speech, but in the Hebrew, it's amarti, what I'm saying, and
This is more
Sha'arim, which is is a lesson.
This is more poetic. It's using similes to explain one.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
actually a parallel to one.
Exactly, because we talked about that Hebrew is a parallelism. Thanks, Sheila, for bringing me back to that point. If Hebrew is a parallelism, the second verse is a parallel to the first verse.
It's telling you how you listen, and it's saying, it's just like rain, it should seep into you.
Right, exactly. Now,
the way when you talked about drop by drop, I watched a friend who was going through chemo, and I could see the drop by drop getting into her body and bringing her life. It
yes. It does go with it. So I thought here we should look at what Everett Fox has said about this. I don't know how many of you have read have Fox's commentaries. I should mention that Fox's translation of the Bible is based on using the Buber and Rosenzweig translations into the German, and he has tried to do in English what they did in German, which was to stay very close to the original Hebrew. And I had the privilege of, it's already about 25, 30 years ago, when he was working on this. He used to come to the Cage conferences, and I was friends with his wife. Yeah. And he used to do sessions where he would try out his translations on the group and get reactions to them. And it was very interesting. I don't think he ever realized that what became his life's work, is now on, you can get it on Sfaria. He's given the rights to it. He's done all these things with it.
His wife is actually my second cousin.
Oh, she's your second cousin?
Yeah. Yeah, and they live in Boston. I'm going to actually see them in a week.
So I think it's I always think of Everett doing that, and then you can download all these online.
If Everett did this, he was doing it on Buber's translation based on the original.
He's using the original Hebrew. He is trying to do what Buber and Rosenzweig did in theirs. He thought that in German they succeeded in conveying the Hebrew when they did the translation. And he thought that too many of the English translations, in an attempt to be acceptable in English, strayed too far. And so he has tried to do in English what they did to the German, using the English and using the sources. But it's been an interesting experience for him doing that. So let's see what he says about what's happening here. If somebody wants to read out, so the people at home who don't have it can, what Fox says about this. Okay.
Especially in the ancient and medieval world, the death accounts of heroes tend to end with inspired visions. The inclusion of an ancient poem here is made to fit further into the context of Moshe's exhortations in Deuteronomy, as a final warning to and witness against the people whom he has led. The song emphasizes the power and caring nature of God, which is contrasted with Israel's pathetic response of unfaithfulness. God is likened to a nurturing parent and a protecting eagle, and Israel responds with idolatry. He turns into a destroyer. Much of this poem reminds us of other biblical literature, such as Psalm 78, also a reprise of Israel's history. That poem is recited as proof of God's choosing the southern house of David. The political motivation behind Deuteronomy 32, if there was one, is no longer clear to us.
So you see, in that sense, Fox is like Alter, saying this is so old that if this was related to something of that nature, I'm not going to skip that part for you. That we don't really know about it anymore. We've lost if that was a connection. So I thought before we move on, take a quick look at Genesis 49, and we're going to see the difference in how this poem continues and how Jacob's.
What page is it?
Genesis 49.
299.
It's on page 299. don't know, but you're good at it. So you'll see that it starts similarly, but and Jacob called his sons and said, "Come together that I might tell you what is to befall you in the days to come." So we know, come together, I'm going to tell you something. Same sort of a beginning. Assemble and hearken, again, a repetition. O sons of Jacob, hearken to Israel your father. And so it's the same kind of an opening. And then there's a paragraph for each of the tribes that telling them what is going to happen to them. And at the very end of it, and then just like the other one is a poem, and then suddenly at the end there's a little bit of prose. You have the same thing at verse 28. All these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number, and this is what their father said to them as he bade them farewell. So you see, it's the same rhythm, the same kind of an opening and addresses as we go through. And then there's one more chapter, and it includes concludes Genesis the same way our poem concludes, with one more chapter. Then it concludes the Torah. So I thought that we should compare them there. All right, let's move on now to verse 3 of our pair. So we're back on 1185. And who wants to do the Hebrew first, and then we'll do the English? Want to do the Hebrew again?
I actually read the Hebrew for Dr. Falk when he first unveiled his
oh, that's nice.
Translation on the Upper West Side of New York, in that huge chapel there. He had a very famous American actor giving off the English translation, this deep black man, deep baritone, blanking on his name. The voice of Darth Vader, that guy.
Okay. No, I wanted to just do verse 3. I don't want you to go this way. Okay, so and let's read the English for it. And
for the name of the Lord I proclaim, give glory to our God.
Right. So and then it's when we look at those together, how many people recognize Havu Godel Eloheinu?
Yeah.
Okay. So where does
I'm
that?
sorry, I didn't get. Do you mind repeating? I didn't hear you.
Sure. So what I wanted to know is when you look at verse 3, you've got Kishem Adonai Ekra Havu Godel Eloheinu.
Yeah. Havu Adonai. And what we say with the Torah?
That in the Amida.
Amida.
So where is it?
Introduction to the
Where is Havu Godel Eloheinu?
185.
The very beginning of the Amidah, when you're about to start to say it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's there, and Kishem Adonai Ekra.
So it's actually, we say it silently before we start the Amidah.
Yes, say it again. And it's there, and
Where did you say it was?
at the start of the Amidah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's it in small print?
Yeah, in the small print.
There's it also is Adonai Sfatai Tiptach. Tafa. The little you sit as you stand. You're supposed to get yourself in ready to speak. Those are the readiness lines. And that's when I was always taught that, because that reminds you you're supposed to stay the Amida standing up with your feet together, and way around. So those are your readiness lines, like when you're getting ready to do an exercise.
Mhm.
You get in line. And based on, so, and we have again, this, if you look at the 4 lines, verse 1 is 2 phrases, verse 2 is 4 phrases, verse 3 is 2 phrases, and then in a minute, verse 4 will be 4 phrases. You see how it lays out, and you can see it much more in the Hebrew than, again, the way the translation. This is one of the things that makes me crazy. The printer who prints the English prints in the style that looks good for the English. But if you want to, again, get the sense of what the Hebrew, it's not only the translation, it's the physical visual layout that helps someone who doesn't read Hebrew.
And this should be in 2 columns then.
Yes, we had seen that when you were here when I showed this. Okay, so
see that.
So for those of you who came in, late, the fact that in the Hebrew it's in 2 columns. So one of the questions when you look at any chumash, one of the things I always, I guess because of my vision issues, I become very aware of is, do they want it to be visually attractive, or are they worried about the cost? And have they made the paper as light as possible? They're using gray ink instead of black because it costs less. And of course, they're thinking about how long the person is going to stand holding the volume. And so how heavy is it? And all of those things impact the translation as much as the words. If your physical experience of using the translation is impinged on in all those ways, and you're not a Hebrew reader, that really makes a difference.
But it makes a big difference visually when you see the 2 or you see the 4.
Absolutely, when you see the 2 or you see the 4, and also when you look at so if you look at the 4 lines on our page 185, and you look at the Hebrew, they've done the indents and outdents to try to give you a sense of what it looks like. But they haven't really done a great job. When I took it off Sefaria for myself, I noticed that though they're using the same translation, they were much more aware of the 2 phrases, 4 phrases, 2 phrases, 4 phrases, so that if you use that online as your source, you got a better sense of what the rhythm was going to be and of reading the poetry.
It's hard to read this poem. So I was here this morning because we had one. So our congregation is blessed. We have a number of rabbis who are just Jews in the pews like me. I run a home care company, right? And so one of my colleagues got called out of town, and they asked some of the Torah reading crew, B'nai Asher, and I'm on it, will you read this poem? And it's hard to read because you got to go from this side to this side, and the scribes lengthen the letters to make them fit into these neat, beautiful columns. And so the reader who was working on it said, I can't do it. My eye keeps going. We're used to reading English. So when you're reading in Hebrew, you're going the other direction. And they're like, our eye keeps bopping down the columns, but you need to go bing bong, bing bong. And so they called me up. They said, get in here and do this. I got the call yesterday afternoon, so I'm here this morning. So I'm not paying full attention because I'm also practicing.
Shalom, is the trope different today? Because
no.
It is a poem?
No, it sounds totally different. I mean, that's how I started to sing. So as our teacher is sharing biblical poetry, you've got a word and then it's modified. So you have basically these couplets. So every verse, it's going to then change just a little bit to give it extra punch.
But the trope is the trope.
Yeah.
Okay.
The point is that when the cantillation was added,
When you do it in Hebrew with the trope, it sounds like poetry.
it sounds like you get because the rhythm is there from the way you sing it.
Right.
It's similar. If you read an opera, or you sing an opera, or you listen to an opera, anything that's meant to be sung, and don't forget, the whole Torah is meant to be chanted, because the reason that the Torah is chanted is people were listening to it. And this is a perfect example. Ha'azinu, give ear, because it's easier to listen to something that's sung or chanted than something that is said to you.
I'll go one further. It's easier to remember it if it's done.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point.
What was that?
Ron mentioned it's easier to remember something that is sung. So it's easier to remember it when you hear it. And if you learn it yourself, it's easier to remember it if it also has a tune or a melody to it.
You're using both sides of the brain.
Right. So like, how many people can chant? Go ahead, Esther.
It also gets the attention of the public that's listening.
Right.
If I listen to somebody who reads it or sings it, it resonates more when it's sung.
Exactly. And how many of you can think of certain sections of the liturgy that you learned as a child and you sang them before you ever learned to read them?
And you sing them sometimes incorrectly. That's what you've heard.
That's what you heard as a little child.
For instance, the
The Via Hafta, and
The Shema.
and the Shema. So
Matovu.
Right, but many people who were brought up where your parents, when you were a little child, sang Kriyat Shema to you and sang Modet in the morning till you learned to do it. However you heard it when you were that very little child, it totally interferes with maybe the correct pronunciation because it's part of how you learned and what you remember. Nina.
It's interesting. What do you read to a small child? Nursery rhymes. So I'm wondering if that's, starting out kids with nursery rhymes.
It's possible. I'll tell you this story. My husband comes from a very musical family. There's several people in the family who sang for the Metropolitan Opera and someone who had a hit record. And when our children were born, he said, well, we'll sing these things at night. I said, what will we sing at night? He said, we'll sing the Shema and we'll sing Just a Song at Twilight. I said, why will we sing Just a Song at Twilight? He said, well, my mother sang that. My grandmother sang that. That's what we sing at night. But he was brought up that you sang something at night before you went to bed. You didn't just somebody kiss you and go to bed. And I was brought up in a family who did that. I was shocked. And maybe that's why we're all so musical. That from the time they were infants, that's what you did before you went to sleep. So it's interesting how the Torah and our forefathers seem to understand this. Rhythm makes a difference. The poem makes a difference because it's rhythmic. Chanting it makes even more of a difference to it. So let's go back to on verse 3. I wanted you to look at what Ismar Sorch said about it. I was looking at the conservative synagogue. I thought I looked on the JTS site and I found what Ismar Sorch talked about Azinu. And I thought that might be of interest if someone wants to read that out for us.
Well, I'll read.
Okay.
Azinu is a final meditation on the nature of the covenant that binds God and Israel. It is that relationship, its gestation, content, and fate, which after all forms the essential plot of the Torah's narrative. Graphic, taut, focused, the poem is written from God's perspective, a foreboding view of the instability of the divine-human relationship. Israel's faithfulness will not be of long duration, nor will the memory of God's beneficence in the period of its infancy reinforce its faith. Rather, prosperity will become its solvent, obliterating any sense of indebtedness and gratitude to God. Worse still, Israel will sever the covenant by cavorting with deities it has never heard of.
So that's, as we move through this, that's the warning that's in it. I wanted to drop down to where he says my summary, because we don't have time to read the whole thing. Could you drop down to my summary and read that last part?
For it. Oh, my summary hardly does justice to the power and beauty of the language or the daringness of the conception. The poem is no less than a CAT scan of God's mind.
That's why I like this.
Yet in terms of theology, it falls disappointingly short. God's reversal is not motivated by compassion, but by pride. Revenge has its price, even for God. No one may detect that God is the author of the script. What is wholly missing from the poem is any expectations that repentance by Israel ought to precede reconciliation with God. In depicting a vision of things to come, Moses seems to have made light of Israel's own religious growth. While its sin did ignite God's wrath, it is not required to do anything to reverse its fate and restore its covenant. The poem bespeaks a world without teshuvah, the capacity to alter God's will through our contrition. It offers little in the way of consolation to soften its somber vision.
So, and this is what we're reading on Shabbat Shuvah, which is it can be either called the Sabbath of return or it's Shabbat Shuvah, the Sabbath of repentance, which I always find that that's what it's called in English, but the Hebrew is Shabbat Shuvah, the Sabbath of return, because when you repent, you return. And which the play between what is chosen as the English translation and when we make tshuva, we turn around and we return to what's the straighter path. So I like the fact that Sorsh calls this a CAT scan of God, which I thought was a really good way to look at this. So now let's look at the fourth verse of the first four that are the opening. And you want to read the fourth one?
Thank you, Dr. Abrams. Atzor tzamim palo ki kol derichav mishpat el emuna ve'in aver tzadik v'yashar hu.
All right, and let's do the English for it.
The rock, his deeds are perfect. Yea, all his ways are just. A faithful God, never false. True and upright is he.
So what I thought is interesting here is the use of the term sur, hatsur.
The rock.
And this is one of the first places in the Torah where God is referred to as sur. As you and we, there's what is the famous part of the liturgy that we use?
Sur Bishlam.
Sur Israel.
Sur Yisrael, Kuma Be'ezrat Yisrael. That's the rock of Israel. Yeah. And in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, Megillat Ha'atzmaut, does anyone know the term for God is Sur? Because Sur is...
And that's because it wasn't a religious document.
And also Sur is the most... basic thing, the least controversial way to refer to God. And I think I did look up. Yes, I looked up what Ibn Ezra said about Sur here as the name for God. The meaning of rock is that God, like a rock, is everlasting. Do not be amazed at this verse. He notices that scripture states in Hosea, the Lord shall roar like the lion. Scripture does this because one who speaks cannot compare God's work to anything but his works, for everything is work. Rock but God is the rock of my heart in Psalm 73 similarly means a support, might, and permanence. Others might say that sur, rock, is related to the word surah, or image. Compare surah form, and in their form shall be for the netherworld in Psalm 49. Its basic meaning is that God does not consist of matter which can be molded into a form. On the contrary, he is primary form. And Ibn Ezra says he thinks that's what this means. Or can't be, it obviously was before chemical analysis.
But I think the most common is.
Esther, hold on. Somebody,
Sorry.
John is going to say something, then I'll call on you.
In the liturgy, I find out the concept to read the sheep.
Right.
By rock and salvation.
Right. Adonai Tzuriv the Goali. Right. Esther, you were going to add?
Well, I just said that Tzur is always referred to the strengths of God, and we need somebody strong behind us, always.
Right. So here, this it's the intro. It says Hatzur, and it doesn't say Tzur. The rock, meaning God. Mm-hmm. And let's see what the words that are here, the parallel is Pa'alo, his deeds, and Drachav, his ways. And then you have for Tzur, you have El, for God. And then you have for Tamim, you have Emunah, and then on the next part you have Sadiq v'Yashar, true and upright. Mm-hmm. So again, if you read it out, Hatzur Tamid Ka'alo Ki Kol Drachav Mishpat El Emunah ve'Ein Avel Sadiq v'Yashar Hu. So the opening 4 lines in that sense are an introduction to the rest of the poem, telling you you need to listen to what I'm going to tell you about what God wants of all of us, and then the rest of the poem is going to pick up on a few things that were here. The part about the dew and showers, and so the last thing I found for you, I'm paying attention to the time, is from Arnie Eisen. And he looks at the issue not only of what is said, but how it's chosen to be said. And so I'm going to go down to the bottom of it. If someone wants to read from Now and Ha'azinu for us.
Now in Ha'azinu, Moses employs a poetry of nature, that which is most real, tangible, and enduring, and uses metaphors to get his listeners to feel and touch what awaits them. Heaven and earth, rain and dew, rock, honey, the fruit of the field, milk of sheep, the fat of lambs, the blood of grapes, the eagle and her young, the sun, moon, mountains, hills, sea, iron, brass, corn, wine. All the ageless contours of human existence, the basic givens that surround and ground ephemeral and variable history, are invoked to invest the not yet experienced with reality.
So here the people of Israel are listening to this in the desert, and all the bounty of nature are all the metaphors that are used throughout the poem. So when you listen to the Torah portion, which if we stop right here, we'll have time for, listen for all the mentions of nature that are throughout the poem. And the poem itself is laying out, it's Moses recapping the experience of the children of Israel and recapping the greatness of God. But as we see here from the opening, it's not necessarily a warning, because as these modern commentators notice, it's based on we have 2 things here. The idea that this is based on really similar ancient poetry, and that we have this tradition throughout the ancient world and even into our time, because we see it in Greek poetry and we see similar things in Shakespeare of and in great novels of deathbed or soliloquies, I guess is the best term for them, when someone wants to give his or her wishes, and in this case, Moses is doing this. And at the very end, there's the prose in which he's reminded, well, the reason this is happening is because you and Aaron hit that rock, and Aaron died peacefully on his mountain. You'll die peacefully on your mountain. But first, we have the 40 verses of this poem of the vision of what's going to happen.
If you look in verses 30 and 31, it talks more about God as the rock.
Yes,
versus the enemy's so-called rock.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I like the parallel you made to Shakespeare, because to me, the Torah is not modern Hebrew, and when you read the Torah, it's like you're reading Shakespeare.
Well, I enjoy reading all ancient languages, and the issue of when you read modernizations. I'm reading an 18th century the Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe, and because I'm going to teach something about Cajun in fiction in January. It's a plug for myself. But it's interesting that the versions you can get the English has been modernized. So it's the same thing. The modern editors, and I say the same thing with great respect for Eitz Chaim and for Robert Alter and for Everett Fox, all assume that we cannot handle something that's really close to the way English was at those times, and that for some reason it will offend us to have these and thous and ye's, etc. It's interesting what sensitivities at different times affect how one looks at the translations. In our case, I think we do want to, wherever we can, look at the original and see what the translation is going to do for us. So with that, I want to wish you Shabbat Shalom.